Order. Statement, the Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change. Secretary Amber Rudd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I'd like to make a statement on ending new subsidies for onshore wind. The Government is committed to meeting objectives on cutting carbon emissions and to continue to make progress towards the UK's 2020 renewable energy targets. The Renewable Electricity Programme aims to deliver at least 30% of the UK's electricity demand from renewables by 2020. We are on course to achieve this objective. Renewables already make up almost 20% of our electricity generation, and there is a strong pipeline to deliver the rest. As we decarbonise, it is imperative that we manage the costs to the consumers. Although renewable energy costs have been coming down, subsidies still form part of people's energy bills, and as the shares of renewables in the mix grows, the impact gets proportionally larger. Mr. Speaker, it is one of this Government's priorities to bring about the transition to low-carbon generation as cost-effectively and securely as possible. The levy control framework, covering the period up to 2020-21, is one of the tools to help achieve this. It limits the impact of support for low-carbon electricity on consumer bills. We have a responsibility to efficiently manage support schemes within the levy control framework to ensure that we maintain public support for the action we are taking to bring down carbon emissions and combat climate change. Government support is designed to help technologies stand on their own 2 feet, not to encourage a permanent reliance on subsidies. We must continue to take tough judgments about what new projects get subsidies. Onshore wind has deployed successfully to date and is an important part of our energy mix. In 2014, onshore wind made up around 5% of electricity generation, supported by around £800 million of subsidies. At the end of April 2015, there were 490 operational onshore wind farms in the UK, comprising 4,751 turbines in total. These wind farms have an installed capacity of 8.3 gigawatts, enough to power the equivalent of over 4.5 million homes. The Electricity Market Reform Delivery Plan projects that we require between 11 to 13 gigawatts of electricity to be provided by onshore wind by 2020 to meet our 2020 renewable electricity generation objective, while remaining within the limits of what is affordable. We now have enough onshore wind in the pipeline, including projects that have planning permission, to meet this requirement comfortably. Without action, we are very likely to deploy beyond this range. We could end up with more onshore wind projects than we can afford, which would lead to either higher bills for consumers or other renewable technologies such as offshore wind losing out on support. We need to continue investing in less mature technologies so that they realise their promise, just as onshore wind has already done. It's therefore appropriate to curtail further subsidised deployment of onshore wind, balancing the interests of onshore developers with those of bill payers. This Government was elected with a commitment to end new subsidies for onshore wind and also to change the law so that local people have the final say on onshore wind applications. Colleagues, including particularly the member for Daventry. Additionally, the member for Montgomeryshire, the member for Selby and Ainsty and the member for Sleaford and North Hykeham have led the way in calling for this. And 6 weeks into this Government, we are acting on that commitment. Alongside proposals outlined within the new energy bill to devolve decision-making for new onshore wind farms out of Whitehall, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, has set out further considerations to be applied to proposed wind energy development in England so that local people have the final say on onshore wind farm applications. I set out to Parliament on the 18th of June proposals to end new subsidies for onshore wind, specifically in relation to the renewables obligation, which will be closed to new onshore wind from the 1st of April 2016, a year earlier than planned. Mr. Speaker, my department's analysis indicates that, after taking account of an early closure, onshore wind deployment under the RO will be in the region of 11.6 gigawatts. With this capacity and that of onshore wind projects that have received support through the new Contracts for Difference, we expect around 12.3 gigawatts of onshore wind to be operating in the UK by 2020, supported by the levy control framework, providing around 10% of electricity generation. This puts us above the middle of the deployment range set out in the EMR delivery plan, our best estimates of what we would need to meet the planned contribution from renewable electricity for our 2020 targets. I have proposed a grace period which would continue to give access to support under the RO to those projects which, as of the 18th of June 2015, already have planning consent, a grid connection, and acceptance and evidence of land rights for the site on which their projects will be built. We estimate that around 7.1 gigawatts of onshore wind capacity proposed across the UK will now not be eligible for the grace period and are therefore unlikely to go ahead as a result of announcement on the 18th of June. That equates to around 250 projects totalling around 2,500 turbines now unlikely to be built. Therefore, by closing the RO to onshore wind early, we are ensuring that we meet our renewable electricity objectives while managing the impact on consumer bills and ensuring that other renewable technologies continue to develop and reduce their costs. Consumer bills will not rise because of this change. Indeed, those onshore wind projects unlikely now to go ahead could have cost hundreds of millions of pounds. And I believe this draws the line in the right place. In advance of this announcement, I and other ministers and officials have been discussing these proposals with the devolved administrations in Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. Now we want to hear the further views from devolved administrations and also industry and other stakeholders. This is just the beginning of the process, and we will continue to consult with them as we move towards implementation. The changes to the renewable obligation do not affect remote island wind proposals, which would not have been in a position to receive RO subsidy even under previous timelines, and I will be saying more about how future CFD projects will be treated in due course. But I am particularly conscious of the fact that 68% of the onshore wind pipeline relates to projects in Scotland. I will continue to consult with colleagues in the Scottish Government. Indeed, I'm meeting the Scottish Energy Minister Fergus Ewing on Wednesday, and by implementing these changes through primary legislation, they will be subject to full parliamentary scrutiny, including from members representing Scottish constituencies. Mr. Speaker, with regard to Contracts for Difference, we have the tools available to implement our manifesto commitments on onshore wind, and will set out how we will do so when announcing plans in relation to further CFD allocations. I will also shortly be considering options for future support for community onshore wind projects that might represent 1 or 2 turbines through the feed-in tariffs as part of the review that my department is conducting this year. I do not wish to stand in the way of local communities coming together to generate low-carbon electricity in a manner that is acceptable, supported by them, including through small-scale wind capacity. However, that action must be affordable as well as acceptable. Mr. Speaker, clean energy doesn't begin and end with onshore wind. Onshore wind is an important part of our current and future low-carbon energy mix. But we are reaching the limits of what is affordable and what the public is prepared to accept. We are committed to meeting our decarbonisation objectives. The changes I have outlined to Parliament will not change this. And I look forward to having meaningful discussions with industry, with other stakeholders and with colleagues in the House and in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland on how we move forward.
Caroline Flint.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for advance notice of her statement today at 2:22. It's only 4 days since I heard the Secretary of State on the Today programme explaining her government's policy changes to onshore winds. This was followed by a written statement later that morning, along with a written Department of Communities and Local Government statement on the same subject. Today, the Secretary of State has been forced to come to this House because of the confusion and concern she has caused. Concern about this government's commitment to our renewable targets and to supporting value for money, confusion as to how her policy will apply in practice and across the renewable sector, where certainty to encourage investment is paramount. Now, I made clear before the general election to the onshore wind sector that whilst I didn't support a cap, a clear pathway to being subsidy-free was an outcome I wanted. So why do I have doubts about the Secretary of State's announcements? We know, despite the fact that something like 69% of the public actually support onshore wind, and it's the most popular of the renewable energy generating supplies. It's true. It's true. It's true. We know that the Secretary of State wants to appease many of her backbenchers who seem to hate onshore wind, although one of them is making money out of a solar farm. For them, the election promise of a cap on onshore wind was music to their ears, although they probably weren't aware, Mr. Speaker, that nearly 1,000 projects had planning permission. But it's not clear to me and many others whether the sum of all her rhetoric really adds up. The Secretary of State has proposed a grace period for projects which, as of last week, when the written statement was announced, have planning consent, access to the grid and land rights in place. Now, can the Secretary of State confirm that, according to her own statement today, that means something like 75% of onshore wind projects with consent will go ahead? The changes to the rules will have to be done through primary legislation, and it could be at least 6 months between last week's statement and royal assent. So can I ask the Secretary of State whether or not, as part of her consultation, she is open to projects that have planning consent, a grid access offer and all land rights sorted before royal assent, being able to continue with the RO arrangement to 2017? In last week's press release, DEC have said that up to 5.2 gigawatts of onshore wind power could still qualify, but other estimates are much lower. So, in her statement today, the Secretary of State refers to 11.6 gigawatts, putting us in the mid-range of fulfilling our 2020 targets for renewable energy. Does this include the 5.2 gigawatt figure? Because if the 5.2 is an overestimate, then presumably that makes meeting our target less likely, and that is extremely concerning given last week we found out that we have already missed our interim 2020 EU renewable target. What discussions has the Secretary of State had with her colleague in DCLG about how many local or neighbourhood plans are required to identify areas suitable for wind energy? What additional costs may be incurred by councils from having to preempt planning applications to avoid a company challenging a decision? And also, out of interest and in the interest of a logical argument, why do these changes to planning policy not apply to all energy generation? Finally, UK-wide energy policy has enabled all of us to share the risks and rewards of developing new and old forms of energy. While Scotland makes up just over 10% of UK households, over 30% of operational onshore wind projects are located in Scotland because of the amount of wind and the contribution of UK-wide bill payers. So it's understandable that Scotland will be worried about the impact on jobs and investment there. And what will she do to give confidence to colleagues in the devolved institutions that there will be a genuine process of consultation? Now, despite the Prime Minister's warm words on tackling climate change in this most important year of global negotiations, this Parliament has hardly begun, but already the cheapest form of renewable energy is under attack, and other renewable investors are worried that they are next. I want our country to go forwards, not backwards. This debate is not about hot air. It is not about hot air. It is about jobs, manufacturing and investment opportunities at risk across the sector. Now, the Secretary of State needs to convince us she understands what's at stake in her answers today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her comments. And first of all, can I just take the opportunity to remind her that this policy was well set out before, as she referred to it, she heard me on the Today programme. It was in the Queen's speech, it was in the manifesto. The Prime Minister had referred to the fact that a Conservative government would take this action. And I have in no way been forced to come here. I chose to come here to make a statement after a number of colleagues wanted wanted the opportunity to have their voice heard in support of this, and I am delighted to give the opportunity to do that. The Right Honourable Lady chose to question this party's commitment to addressing our climate change obligations. Fortunately, she gave me the opportunity to do that just 10 days ago or so, when one of the first Opposition Day debates was on climate change, and I was able to tell her and the House about the commitment that this government has to meeting those targets, about the commitment that this government has and the Prime Minister has to getting a deal in Paris this year. We are committed to making sure that we deliver on our decarbonisation targets, but just as importantly, we are committed to getting a global deal. We do not want to do this alone. We need to provide leadership in the EU and leadership internationally to make sure that the effort that we make is truly leveraged so that we can get that result at the end of the year. It is disappointing that the Right Honourable Lady chooses to throw confusion where actually none exists. I think I was very clear in the statement about the amount of gigawatts and the range that we were targeting, but just to repeat it for her, we hope to have 10% of electricity generation from wind by 2020. We are reaching that target early. That is a key reason for ending the subsidy for onshore wind now. We want to fall in the middle. In fact, it looks likely slightly in the upper end of that range. And having achieved that, it is right not to put further pressure on people's bills. Because unlike the Right Honourable Lady and unlike the party opposite, we believe we can do this in a way that is cost effective. We are absolutely committed to making sure that we support renewables, but we want to do it in the most cost effective, the low-cost pathway we can. In answer to her question about regulation and particularly planning permission on different sources of energy, it is right that different sources of energy have different type of regulation. It is right that they fall under different planning regimes. Part of what we are trying to do is to encourage new energy sources in order to meet our targets, in order to lead to cost reductions. That is why we have different setups for different ones in order to get the best outcome, both for our targets and for bill payers. Finally, she asked me about Scotland. I have no doubt I will be answering questions from that side of the House. I look forward to addressing them and to taking them, and I have had many conversations with devolved administrations, and I look forward to taking further questions from them. Thank you.
Mr. Stephen Phillips.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome this statement from my right honourable friend and indeed encourage her to ignore the hot air which comes from the right honourable lady opposite and the opposition benches on this subject. And can I thank her for all she's doing to prevent Lincolnshire being carpeted in wind turbines, which is what nobody in my constituency wants. Can I ask her whether her department will be prepared to publish on its website a list of all the projects which this announcement will affect, so that those in Lincolnshire and across the country who do not want to see the countryside carpeted in these turbines can know whether or not individual projects are going ahead?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and I know that he has felt, as representing his community, that there's been too much deployment in his area, and I recognise the support that he has given in helping us to develop this policy. Each developer will need to contact the department in order to give a complete answer, and we will be working with developers to make sure that it is clear which ones are within this and which ones aren't. And at some stage, you'll have to give me a little time to get through it. That will be published on the website as well.
Mr. Stewart Hosie.
Can I thank the Minister for her statement and early sight of it? She said 6 weeks into this government they were acting on this policy, and of course they are, but that doesn't make it right. She said they're reaching the limits of what is affordable. We agree. We have reached the limits of what is affordable in terms of the strike price for nuclear and the subsidy to nuclear. She said we've reached the limits of what the public are prepared to accept. I think the public have already reached the limit on the failure to decarbonise and tackle climate change. This statement, this decision, is simply wrong. And the answer to the last honourable gentleman was instructive. They're prepared to publish all of these projects that are pooled. I hope she's going to publish all of the jobs that are lost and investment foregone because of this decision. Now, I'm hearing lots of chuntering. I think we're getting to the truth now. They simply don't like renewables. They'd rather see the costs of decommissioning for nuclear passed on to future generations. We're concerned mainly at the damage this decision will do. The announcement places at risk a huge investment pipeline conceived in good faith by developers under the rules previously in place. So is the Minister aware this decision has a disproportionate impact on Scotland and puts investment at risk? She appears to be aware that around 70% of the onshore wind projects in the current planning system are in Scotland. And is she aware on that basis of what Neil Stewart said, the Chief Executive of Scottish Renewables, that cutting support for onshore wind would be bad for jobs, bad for investment, and would only hinder Scotland and the UK's efforts to meet binding climate change targets? Is she not concerned at all that currently £3 billion worth of onshore wind projects in the pipeline in Scotland are at risk with so sudden a closing of the renewables obligation, and that would do incredible damage to investor confidence, not simply in offshore wind, but in the wider UK energy sector as well? Now, I agree with her when she said that the subsidy cost of renewables must reduce so that both renewables and climate targets are achieved at the lowest cost and consumers protected. But is she not concerned of the danger in a headlong rush to scrap subsidies for onshore wind, the cheapest large-scale renewable technology? Has she ignored the comments from the industry, not least from Keith Anderson, the Chief Executive of Scottish Power Renewables, when he said onshore wind is clearly still the most cost-effective large scale of deploying renewable technology in the UK? Economically, you would therefore question, and I'm quoting what he said, why in God's name would you want to bring that to a premature halt? So why on earth...
Order. I feel confident that the honourable gentleman is in his last sentence and much nearer the end of it than the beginning. Mr Hosie.
Indeed. The Minister said last week there would be up to 5.2 gigawatts of onshore wind capacity eligible for grace periods. We found out later that figure was only 2.9 gigawatts. Today she said 7.1% would no longer be eligible for subsidy. Why didn't the Minister come clean last week with the proper figures?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Could I just gently say to the member for Dundee East, he has failed, I believe, to accept any of the points I have made here in terms of the commitment that this government has to climate change, addressing it, the commitment that we have to keeping the bills down, and the commitment that we have to delivering a variety of renewable energy sources. It is not just about onshore wind. He has also failed to acknowledge the fact that we have in some environments, we have too much pressure on the communities with onshore wind. Could I just gently quote to him from Fergus Ewing, the Minister for Business, Energy and Tourism in 2007, who said, "Wind farms have a very heavy environmental footprint and also release substantial quantities of methane from peat landscapes. Many other forms of renewable energy are the future, not unconstrained wind farms." Well, I agree with him on that. We must recognise that sometimes when members of Parliament choose to fight for their community, they take a different view to the National Party. And I am here representing the view of members of Parliament as well as the National Party. And we believe that this policy addresses communities and also addresses keeping bills down.
Mr John Redwood.
Does the Secretary of State agree that whilst this is a very welcome measure, other things are also going to be needed in order to control bills and tackle fuel poverty? And isn't it interesting that only the Conservative Party in this House now cares about the consumer and wants to get the bills down?
Well, the honourable member is characteristically, right honourable member is characteristically on the money in terms of addressing that. That is absolutely the aim of what we are trying to do, to reduce emissions, to give a variety of renewable energy, and to make sure that the bill payer, individual bill payers, looking at their bills when they get home, can make sure that that continues to come down.
Yeah. Mr. Ben Bradshaw.
Investment and how many jobs will be lost to the economy of the southwest of England as a result of her decision?
Actually, the investment in renewable energy over the past 6 years has been £7 billion a year. We are committed to making sure that the UK is the leading country in developing renewable energy. Offshore wind we have been particularly successful in, and on offshore wind we have more offshore wind than the rest of the world put together, and we hope to become a serious exporter of it. Renewable energy is important for jobs as much as it is important for developing on our commitments.
Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Speaker, I welcome the Secretary of State's announcement today, and it's great to hear that we're on course to meet 30% of our electricity generation from renewables. She's absolutely right to divert the resources into the less mature technologies, but would she reassure my constituents that that won't mean that we see a further expansion in very large-scale field solar across South Devon, and that perhaps there'll be more support for community energy schemes, and I hope she'll take me up on an offer to come and visit Totnes constituency to see how that works in action.
I wholeheartedly agree with the Honourable Lady. Her constituents sound very similar to mine. We support the targets and the desire to make sure that we address the issue of climate change. The problem is we do not want large-scale solar. In fact, large-scale solar has already been taken out of the renewable obligation, and what we are doing is trying to support solar so that we have as much as possible on community energy, on people's houses, on buildings. There's a great opportunity there.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The IMF recently reported that Britain subsidised fossil fuel industry to the tune of over £1,000 per household, whereas onshore wind is just £10 per household. So if she's serious about affordability and climate change, why isn't she tackling fossil fuel subsidies instead of slashing wind, one of the most popular and affordable of the energy sources?
Can I urge the Honourable Lady to take a look at that report? I also saw those statements, and I thought it was so extraordinary that I asked for a copy of it, the IMF report. And if she would like to have a discussion with me about it, I would be happy to do that. It is not a direct subsidy in the way that we understand it. It is an important point. It is right to reduce fossil fuel. It is right particularly to address the dirtiest form of fossil fuel, but the real danger they do is in health and environmental impact, and that's why we need to get rid of them.
Sir Alan Duncan.
Speaker, at the planning stage, a photo montage never really gives an accurate picture of the visual impact of these turbines. Will the Secretary of State consider making it compulsory for applicants to fly a blimp in order better to show the real height of any turbine that is proposed?
Well, that is a totally novel suggestion to me. I'm not familiar with the workings of blimps, but I look forward to further advice on it.
Yes. Ian Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Wednesday, tens of thousands of campaigners came to London to ask us to do more for climate change. What do we tell them now about this government's priorities when it cuts subsidies for renewables and increases them for fracking?
I also met with constituents, and particularly with the leaders in my department of the march, and I think we should tell them the truth. And the truth is that this government is continued to being the greenest government ever. We will deliver on our climate change targets. We are committed to getting a deal in Paris, so I would urge the honourable gentleman to stick to the truth.
Mr. Peter Lilley.
Now that my right honourable friend is abolishing subsidies on the least uneconomic form of renewables, may we reasonably assume that she proposes... May we now assume that she proposes to make corresponding reductions in subsidies for offshore wind, which impose 2 or 3 times as great burden on the cost of living, particularly of poor households?
Well, I'm sorry to disappoint the right honourable gentleman, but we won't be reducing those. But what we are doing, that I know he will approve of, is now we have a market-led system through the CFD. We are able to push for the reduction in prices, which in the CFD auction that took place last year was very effective at getting the price down.
Hugh Irranca-Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I suggest to the Secretary of State in a helpful way, it would be really helpful if she could publish as much information as possible on the risk analysis she's made of this decision to bring forward the phasing out early, not least because of those who do fear that with us already being behind on the interim targets to reach the 2020 renewables targets, and the jeopardy that that might place upon our climate change obligations as well, that we do need to see to what level this has been tested on the risk that some of these projects might fail and undercut it, and also that there might be any transfer to more expensive renewables should any projects fail. So I say to her, it would be of help to the committee and to other committees if as much information as possible were published so that that could be properly examined.
Can I start by congratulating the Honourable Gentleman on becoming Chair of the Environmental Audit Committee? I look forward to getting to know him better. I'm sure I'll have the opportunity at that committee. Can I say also that we don't agree that we haven't met our targets? I understand that was reported as such, and I will take an early opportunity to write to him to set that out. And I take to heart his advice to make sure that we publish as much as possible, above all to win everybody's confidence that what I'm saying is absolutely achievable.
Mr. David Jones.
Congratulate my right honourable friend on her statement, which I can assure her will be widely welcomed across North Wales. Does she agree with me that onshore wind power has for too long been the low-hanging fruit of renewable energy and has therefore been grossly over-subsidised? And does she agree with me also that her statement today opens the way for advancing more innovative forms of renewable technology, such as, for example, tidal lagoons?
Well, I welcome his comments of support. I do agree that it should give us the opportunity to diversify with other forms of renewable energy, and that is one of the key points for doing this. We do not want to continue to spend too much money on onshore wind while we have to harbour our resources, look after the bill player and make sure that we have the greatest opportunity possible to support other forms of renewable energy.
Boswell.
The strike price agreed for nuclear is £92.50 per megawatt hour at Hinkley Point, more expensive than the £82.50 megawatt hour for onshore renewables. Onshore renewables do not leave future generations with the cost of decommissioning of nuclear facilities and waste. Why is the UK government proceeding with such an irrational decision?
Well, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for the opposition to make 2 points in response to him. One is our energy needs to be a mix. We cannot purely have renewable energy. We need the baseload stability of having nuclear or some oil and gas to make sure that we can deliver whether the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. That's still an important part of our mix. And the decommissioning issue he raises, that is included in the price.
Sir Alan Mack.
Speaker, may I join honourable members across the House in welcoming the Secretary of State's statement today, which will certainly be popular in my South Coast constituency of Havant. Does the Secretary of State welcome the £9.5 billion of investment in offshore wind, which has taken place since 2010, showing that area of the sector still has lots of room to grow?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. Offshore wind has continued to deploy very successfully and prices coming down, and we are delighted that the UK is such a leader in that area and has the real prospect of exporting into other countries in that area as a leader in renewable offshore energy.
Mr Barry Gardner.
Sir, by ending support a year earlier than her department promised only 8 months ago, the government is sending yet another message to investors that the UK is not a stable regulatory regime in this area. Does she accept the calculations that show onshore wind is not only the cheapest form of new low-carbon energy, but that for every pound of development cost, 98 pence is spent creating new jobs in the UK? Jobs which were projected to double to 37,000 by 2023 had that support continued.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman fails to incorporate at all the fact that all this support costs money. We cannot ignore the fact that obviously people want subsidies if they're on the receiving end of subsidies, but we have to make sure that we get the good measure of it. I would also say that he is wrong in saying that this government said this and that government said that. The fact is, we said in our manifesto that if we had a Conservative majority, we would deliver that. The industry was not surprised by the outcome here. We committed to ending new subsidies for onshore wind, and that is exactly the promise that we've kept.
Sir Redwood Garnier.
My right honourable friend very rightly mentioned our honourable friend, the member for Daventry, my parliamentary neighbour. He and I have worked both individually and together to ensure the best interests of our respective constituents in relation to unsightly and unwelcome wind farms. Would she ensure, in discussions with our right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for the DCLG, that there is imposed upon future wind farms a minimum distance between the wind farm or the turbine and human habitation from dwellings?
I thank the honourable member for Harborough for his comments, and I know he has also been an active campaigner in this area. He will have observed that the Secretary of State for DCLG, as he puts it, is sitting here, and I'm sure he will have taken his comments to heart.
Tom Brake.
Could I bring the Secretary of State back to the issue of job losses? Would she like to go on record now and confirm how many jobs amongst the 19,000 people employed in the onshore industries will be lost as a result of her proposals?
The honourable gentleman fails to acknowledge the fact that the UK is one of the leaders in renewable energy. We continue to invest, we continue to support a variety of renewable energy sources. They will continue to provide jobs, and it is up to this government to make sure that we spend the money wisely to maximise the delivery of renewable energy and, of course, maximise the delivery of new jobs.
Kit Malthouse.
Mr Speaker, this would be welcome news indeed across the whole of North West Hampshire, not least because the Secretary of State said, I think, twice that the final say would be given to local communities. Could she just reassure those worried communities that that means they cannot now be overruled by the Planning Inspectorate?
Yes, I can.
Mr David Hanson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Investor confidence is key, and this announcement was made on the day I was in North Wales with Gwyntermore wind farm, the biggest wind farm, second biggest wind farm in the world, opening, and all the investors could see was a government not committed to wind and renewable energy. Yeah. Could she say for the onshore wind industry, such as West Coast Energy in my constituency, whether or not there will be a new round for contracts for difference, and if so, whether onshore wind will feature in any part of it?
Mr Speaker, I did refer in my statement to the fact that under contracts for difference we will be implementing the terms of the manifesto.
James Cleverley.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As local communities are the ones who have to deal with the visual impact of wind farms, is it not the case that they should be the ones that have the final say on this and other visually intrusive forms of renewable energy like large-scale solar farms?
The honourable gentleman for Braintree is exactly right. That is one of the key purposes of this announcement. It is to make sure that we involve local communities so they feel they have the right and the involvement to say how their environment is affected.
Catherine West.
Has the Secretary of State carried out an economic impact assessment on the small business community and the supply chain affected by this abrupt and confused change to government policy?
I would say that one element of small businesses that will be pleased with this outcome is probably the tourist industry. A lot of colleagues campaigned against the expansion of wind farms on the basis that it affects tourism, and tourism is an important part for small businesses.
Mr David Mowat.
Speaker, the Secretary of State will be aware that since 2010 our country has increased renewables by 300%, a factor of 3, more than anybody else in the OECD. But we also need to make progress on other forms of decarbonisation. Is she still committed to the advancement of Hinkley Point C, which will produce more carbon-free electricity than all the wind farms we currently have deployed?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and yes is the answer. We do need nuclear, we need new nuclear in order to provide the stability, in order to be able to, in a way, expand our renewables while at the same time having stable other sources of energy. We are at Hinkley Point.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can the Minister say how cutting subsidies to onshore wind energy is providing leadership in the EU on decarbonising our economy, as you have just claimed in your statement?
The issue about providing leadership in the EU and indeed internationally is about meeting our targets and showing that we can meet them in the most cost-effective way and liaising with other countries in order to show them what we're doing to do that. And the point about this announcement is that we will still be meeting our targets.
Chris Heaton-Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, I welcome the statement and thank the Secretary of State for it. Does she understand how onshore wind subsidies and developers have really gone about their business in such a way that they've actually destroyed people's faith in renewable energies as a whole? Indeed, in communities in my constituency, Winnet, Kelmarsh, Watford and Crick, you'll struggle to find people who support any type of renewable energy based on how they've been handled by onshore wind developers. And finally, would she please list in the pipeline those wind farms that have got the connection to the grid that she listed, because that could relieve a whole host of onshore communities that might be affected by onshore in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I again pay tribute and homage to the Honourable Member for Daventry, who campaigned so hard on this and led on it. And I know his constituents will be absolutely delighted with this outcome. I am disappointed to hear, though, that the impact of wind farms has made them negative about renewables in general. I hope we can win them back by our policies that will increasingly involve them. In terms of individual members who want to know what the impact is on developments in their constituency, I would urge them to write to me and I will try and get that information.
Paul Blomfield.
The Secretary of State said that the government's priority was to bring about transition to low-carbon generation as cost-effectively as possible. Does she not recognise that onshore wind is the most cost-effective renewable energy production form?
Well, I would make 2 points to that. I would ask him to recognise that as part of our targets to have affordable renewable energy, we aim to have 10% from wind by 2020, and we are on schedule to deliver that. So we have to harbour our resources. There would be no point saying, OK, it's come down in price, let's put all the money over there. That would be the wrong thing to do. What we have to do is deliver a mix of renewable energy. Offshore is beginning to come down. We have plans for carbon capture and storage. There are new initiatives coming up the whole time. This is an exciting, changing area, and we need to harbour our resources to make sure that we can support the right outcomes.
Heidi Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Standing up at the right time now. I just wanted to say to my right honourable friend, the constituents of mine in South Cambridgeshire will be delighted. Those in the north, whose villages have been blighted by the Cotton Wind Farm, they can't sleep, they can't sell their houses. And in the south of my constituency, where we have large solar farms coming at us. Thank you. In the south of the constituency, where we have large solar farms coming left, right and centre, today you will have made a lot of people very happy, so thank you.
Well, I thank the honourable lady for her comments. Thank you.
Chris Matheson.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask the Secretary of State, in her opinion, which would cause more environmental damage to the Cheshire countryside, a wind turbine or a fracking rig?
Well, I'm happy to say that a wind turbine, a single wind turbine, if a community wants it, will still be allowed. We're very keen to support community energy. And as far as shale exploration is concerned, we're at an early stage and we'll have to wait and see how the community responds.
Mr. Andrew Percy.
Constituents on the north of the Isle of Wrexham, who will shortly be surrounded by 100 turbines, will be very happy with this announcement. I welcome what she said, but I would urge her on individual turbine applications to perhaps go further, because many landowners in my constituency put in one application, get approval, then another, and it's death by 1,000 cuts.
OK, well, the honourable gentleman makes an interesting point, and I will look out for that eventuality.
Liz McInnes.
Mr. Speaker. The established wind farm on Scout Moor, adjacent to my constituency, only has a lifetime of 25 years. What is the Secretary of State's long-term plan for renewable energy when existing wind farms have to be decommissioned?
Well, the extraordinary thing about renewable energy is that it is such a fast-moving field. In 20 to 25 years' time, no less, in 10 or 15 years' time, nobody knows which will be the dominant renewable energy being able to supply cost-effective. Perhaps we'll have developed storage, perhaps carbon capture and storage will be coming online. There are so many unknowns in this area, so I would urge the honourable lady to keep an open mind about different sources of renewable energy, just as this department does.
Baron Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Secretary of
State for a very clear statement and responses regarding communities and tourism. In my constituency of Gower, there's a mountain range known as Mynydda Gwair, forming a backdrop to the first area of outstanding natural beauty. And it's been granted planning permission by Swansea City Council's Labour Council for one of Wales's largest wind farms, against the wishes of a clear majority of local residents and indeed farmers. Will the Secretary of State agree with me that this cannot be right, and remedying such absurd decisions by allowing communities to decide these sort of things is essential?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman's experience does seem to validate the approach that we are taking, whereby local communities will have much more involvement and choice in those decisions.
Yes. Tasmina Ahmed Sheikh.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Notwithstanding anything the Secretary of State has said this afternoon, the pipeline of projects in Scotland is now at risk, as are the jobs of 5,400 people employed in the sector. Will she look again at the impact these proposals will have on Scotland and the wider UK economy and think again?
Yeah. Well, the Honourable Lady, I'm afraid, has to bear in mind that this is a manifesto commitment. The UK has made this commitment, and I appreciate that she would like a different arrangement, but the arrangement that we have put in place will impact on subsidies throughout the UK. But I am happy, and I will listen to different suggestions that might come from my Scottish counterparts about how different arrangements might be put in place within the changes that I have set out.
Order, Mr MacDonald. For an aspiring statesman, frenetic gesticulation is a tad unseemly. John Howell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I welcome this statement, and as she knows, I had a role in the development of neighbourhood plans at their very beginning. If local communities decide not to pursue a wind turbine, will she reassure me that she will give precedence to those neighbourhood plans over anything else in the planning system?
Yeah. Well, I thank the honourable gentleman. My honourable friend from Henley for that comment, and I know that he was the great man who developed the neighbourhood plan, and he is absolutely right. Neighbourhood plans will be the central tone on this, and it will allow communities to have the authority that they need on the planning decisions that would be impacted in this situation.
Steve McCabe.
Will the Secretary of State explain how she reconciles giving local people the right of veto over wind turbines, but denies them exactly the same right over shale gas fracking or a nuclear power station next door?
The honourable gentleman will be aware that this right that is now being given to communities wasn't in place when wind farms originally came into place. We now have enough, and we have now put that in place. I would say that the same is the case for other sources of energy. That is not necessary now, because it is right that we have a different approach for a different type of energy, which is at a different level of maturity.
Mr. David Morris.
Mr Speaker. And may I thank the Secretary of State for bringing this brave decision forward and pay homage to my friend from Daventry. He has been exemplary in fighting the corner of getting rid of these wind farms. But what I would really like to know is, has there been any decommissioning thoughts whatsoever of these wind farms in the next 15 years? Because some have been up for 10 years now, and I would hazard a guess it would be more than nuclear power stations.
Well, it's a reasonable point. The honourable gentleman has raised an interesting point. It is in part of their proposals. We are aware and involved in the decommissioning plans, but nobody quite knows when that will be. But we will keep a careful eye on it.
Brendan O'Hara.
Speaker, given the Prime Minister's respect agenda, can I ask what cognisance, if any, did the Minister take of the impact of her decision on Scotland, and in particular my constituency of Argyll and Bute? And is she aware, or doesn't she care, about the damage this decision will have on the fragile rural economies of Scotland and the inevitable job losses that will follow?
I have been having several discussions and meetings with Fergus Ewing, and I will continue to do that. Jobs in the UK are incredibly important. It is Britain that is open for business, and we will continue to make sure that renewable investment flows.
Mr. Robert Jenrick.
Can I thank my right honourable friend and also the previous Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, who fought an incredible rearguard action calling in applications like that which would have blighted the view of Southwell-Minster for generations to come. If communities should have their say, to keep it simple, would my right honourable friend encourage and support councils like Rushcliffe Borough Council, who want to declare themselves a wind turbine-free council and protect the Vale of Belvoir forever?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that interesting suggestion. They, of course, have the final say, and if that is how they put it, that is up to them.
Mr. Andrew Gwynn.
But is she not just a little bit concerned of the impact on investor confidence that this decision might have, not just in terms of onshore wind, but across the renewable sector? And given that onshore wind and its supply chain accounts for £1.7 billion of gross value added, how does she anticipate filling that gap in investment?
Investors will have seen the manifesto. Investors will have heard the words of the Prime Minister last year when he said under a Conservative government there will be no onshore wind subsidies. They will have known that our target was 11 to 13 gigawatts by 2020, and they are likely to have known that wind was deploying faster and more effectively than people had thought, partly because they would have been on the receiving end of those subsidies. Continuing to get investment in renewables, making sure Britain is open for business and remains at the front of delivering renewable energy will continue under this government.
Chris Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I make the rare step of agreeing with the right honourable lady opposite in saying, when she said that the backbenchers would be pleased with this statement. Can I assure her that I'm absolutely delighted with this statement, but most importantly, so will the vast majority of my constituents in Brecon and Radnorshire and across Mid Wales and much further afield. What estimate, may I ask the Secretary of State, has she made on the amount of money that scrapping the renewables obligation will save this country?
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and I am delighted to make him and his constituents happy. The answer to his question is by closing it 1 year early is likely to save hundreds of millions.
Mark Duncan.
The Secretary of State hasn't indicated whether she has been apprised of any particular implications in the context of Northern Ireland, not least in the setting there of the single electricity market for the island. She has promised consultation. She says she wants consultation with the devolved administrations, industry and stakeholders. Given her certitude, how might that consultation have any influence on her position?
Well, I have had both meetings and conversations with my opposite number in Northern Ireland. I will continue to do so. I respect their views, which are different to what we are trying to implement, and I have been working with them to see whether it is possible for Northern Ireland to implement and potentially to fund the subsidy themselves.
Mark Spencer.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State will be aware that the cost of bringing forward an application can be vast in seeking approval from national air traffic control systems. Where those applications meet ferocious local community opposition, is there any way in which she can assist those applicants to withdraw their application? Because they are often faced with the choice of pushing on with that application to try and recover the costs of the reaching air traffic control approval, as well as other environmental assessments.
I don't think I say to my honourable friend that there would be a role for government in that particular suggestion he has. What I do think, though, is that having heard the announcement today, developers may take a different view.
Chris Law.
Given the consultations that you've outlined, the Secretary of State's outlined, discussions with Scottish Energy Minister, what impact has been advised to the Scottish Government of the proposals on Scotland's target on generating equivalent 100% electricity consumption from renewable sources by 2020?
I'm happy to say that this change to the subsidy regime will not impact on the UK target. As far as the Scottish Government's target, I've had no further discussion with my Scottish counterpart.
Glyn Davis.
Good man.
Large numbers of my constituents in Montgomeryshire, Mr. Speaker, will welcome today's statement with a huge relief. Mid Wales has been saved from desecration. Can my right honourable friend confirm that onshore wind subsidies that will not apply to any proposed wind farm that does not currently have planning permission?
As set out in my statement, onshore wind subsidy grace period is only available to wind farms or wind farm applications that have planning consent, a grid connection and land rights.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also had several constituents who came to see me for the climate change lobby last week, and they will be at a loss, really, in terms of the Secretary of State statement. But could I ask her to respond to the CBI's comment, which was cutting the renewables obligation scheme early sends a worrying signal about the stability of the UK's energy market. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, I would say to the CBI, who I will be meeting with, and I'm sure I will discuss this amongst other things, that this is a stable environment in terms of renewable investment, because we have set out the ranges and the targets that we would like to achieve, and we are meeting that. And this government is the first government to have set out a levy control framework so that investors can see exactly how much money we are committing to this, and it is partly because, as a government, we are determined to look after money so carefully that we are making this change to make sure that we stay well within the levy control framework.
Order. If I am to accommodate remaining colleagues in the exchanges on this statement, brevity is now of the essence. Mr. Nigel Adams.
Speaker, a former Secretary of State who went on to become Leader of the Opposition once said that to object against onshore wind farms was akin to antisocial behaviour. Thank goodness we now have a Secretary of State who listens to constituents in rural areas like mine. Now, councils will inevitably be challenged at appeal by highly paid barristers, Mr. Speaker. What assistance will her department give to those small councils so that they can fully understand the new powers that they've been granted?
I would say to the honourable gentleman from Selby and Ainsty, who has done so much to campaign against wind farms in his constituency, that the statement is very clear. And if his councils want any further clarification, they should write to me, and I will make sure that they get a clear response.
Mrs. Helen Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, in his encyclical on climate change, the Pope said continuity is essential. Policies related to climate change cannot be altered with every change of government. With him, I'd like to ask the Secretary of State this question. What would induce anyone at this stage to hold on to power only to be remembered for their inability to take action when it is urgent and necessary to do so?
Well, can I urge the Honourable Lady, when she has the chance to talk further to the Pope, to let him know that we will be meeting our commitments, and this is part of our plan today, is to make sure that we do make those commitments. There is no change to this government's, this department's, this Prime Minister's commitment to addressing dangerous climate change.
Victoria Atkins.
I welcome the statement today, as will many, many residents in Louth and Horncastle, which has borne more than its fair brunt of the wind turbine industry. I have a question for the Secretary of State. Would the Secretary of State consider a 2 strikes and you're out policy for those developers who keep coming back again and again, tweaking their applications, causing local councils hundreds of thousands of pounds in legal fees and causing prolonged distress for local residents?
I think that the Honourable Lady, who makes a good point, will find that under this new regime, as has been announced today and last week, that the community have the final say. So councils will be in a much stronger position to make that clear to any developers who approach them.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Minister aware, another of the best of both worlds offered to Scottish electorate was the onshore subsidies. Therefore, given the effect that the proposals will have on investment in Scotland, and I would actually challenge that pulling investment was not part of your manifesto, does the Minister agree with me that this is an equivalent of another broken promise to the Scottish electorate?
Well, I don't agree with the honourable gentleman. Having Britain open for business is incredibly important. Scotland has a lot of wind farms, received a lot of investment. I'm sure that with this government in charge, investment will continue to flow to Scotland in all sorts of ways.
Mr. Mr. Peter Bone.
Mr. Speaker, my constituents would be delighted that we now have a Conservative government, because if we had a coalition government, we would have never had that statement and we wouldn't have the excellent Secretary of State at the dispatch box. Could you just confirm, so I've got it clear in my mind, if the Borough Council of Wellingborough turned down a planning application for a wind farm, it cannot be overturned by the Planning Inspectorate?
Yes, I can confirm that.
Mr. Graham Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members on this side of the House are rightly concerned about job losses and job insecurity. But that's not restricted to onshore. Given that the doubling of carbon tax by this government on the 1st of April is likely to be the final nail in the coffin of the coal mining industry, almost 1,000 jobs at Hatfield, will the Minister recognise the need for a long-term plan identifying a diverse energy mix in the interest of the nation?
Well, I share the honourable gentleman's view about needing a diverse energy mix. We want to support renewables, we want to ensure that we make our renewable targets and we encourage a diverse form of renewable energy, but we also need certain other types of energy to make sure that we have the base load available at all times of the day.
Mr. David Nuttall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Scoutmore wind farm, which has already been referred to by the Honourable Lady for Haywood and Middleton, dominates the skyline for thousands of my constituents. An application to extend it even further has been submitted but not determined. Is the Secretary of State able to confirm whether or not this extension will attract subsidy?
I would ask the honourable gentleman to be kind enough to write to me about that particular example, and I will make sure that he gets a reply.
Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, we worked very hard in Hull to bring Siemens to the city to develop the offshore renewables industry. Does the Minister really understand how this approach and the previous approach around solar is not at all helpful to long-term investment in renewables?
I'm slightly amazed that the honourable lady chooses to approach it like that. It is a great success of the last government that we now have this Siemens plant in Hull, and we are supportive of that, of the employment and of, we hope, the export potential that will also develop there. We are encouraged by the fact that there is more investment coming into offshore wind and will continue to support it.
Mr. Richard Graham.
Mr. Speaker, in the mix of renewable energy, tidal energy has huge potential, popular support, leisure sector spin-offs, innovative technology and a real export potential. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the direct and indirect potential for job growth from tidal energy will be hugely greater than any job losses from her announcement today?
I certainly agree that tidal and indeed marine energy is an exciting part of a future energy mix, and as he's aware, we are continuing to do our due diligence on various tidal projects.
Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with some of the comments from the previous member to speak, because the Secretary of State will be aware that the position of the Scottish Government is that technologies such as tidal power and wave power, which were prevented from proper development by a former Conservative government, are where the long-term future of our energy lies. Can't you therefore confirm whether the entire value of subsidy that's going to be clawed back from wind farms will be reinvested into the accelerated development of these long-term permanent technologies, or are we simply seeing a repeat of what her party did to Scotland in the 1980s, when a flourishing and potentially world-leading renewables energy sector in Scotland was deliberately sacrificed to get it out of the way of the nuclear power lobby?
I'm afraid the honourable gentleman hasn't quite understood the proposal that we have here, which is that the onshore wind subsidy will not be going ahead after March 2016. That is not money that's being clawed back. That is money that is additionally not being added to people's bills. But on another matter, I do agree with him that we would like to see more deployment or more success, shall we say, in the whole marine energy area. And it is partly because we want to make sure that we have sufficient support available for other technologies like marine, tidal, wave, that we have to make this choice.
Mr. Philip Hollowbone.
Earlier answer, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, said that the subsidy regime for large-scale solar farms was also going to be cut back. What is there to stop an applicant for a large-scale solar farm parcelling up that application into 4 or 5 separate applications, thus qualifying as a small-scale unit?
The honourable gentleman makes a very good point. He is right. We have ended the large-scale solar farm issue in terms of their application for the renewable obligation, but I do have concerns of exactly the point that he has raised, and I will be addressing it in the feed-in tariff review that I will be doing this summer.
Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Huddersfield Civic Society, the RSPB, Natural England, National Trust, local artist Ashley Jackson and the CPRE have major concerns and are opposing a huge wind farm development high up on moorland in my constituency. Will the Secretary of State confirm it will actually be local people now that have the final say on this major development?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that list of supporters, and I can indeed give him that confirmation.
Mr John Glenn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In South Wiltshire, the primary concern is around large-scale solar farm applications. Could the Secretary of State outline the implications of today's announcement for residents from Downton who came to see me about this very recently?
Well, I would refer my honourable friend to the answer I just gave earlier, which is that we will be looking again at how solar farms get access under the feed-in tariff review. They are no longer eligible to access under the renewable obligation.
Tom Pursglove.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I would refer members to my declaration of interest, but very much welcome this announcement today. On Friday, my constituent, Peter Stevens, asked whether the forthcoming international deliberations on climate change would have the effect of unpicking the changes that the Secretary of State has set out today. Perhaps you could clarify.
I'm happy to reassure the honourable gentleman and his constituent that we remain committed to our targets under the Climate Change Act. We remain committed to being the greenest government ever and to making sure that we are the #1 place for renewable energy investment.
Order.